Hello, everybody. This is Editing Gavin here from the future, compared to the Gavin you're about to hear. So, just a quick little content warning here. If you are squeamish in any way, this may not be the episode for you. This is one of our Mike Takes the Wheel episode, where Mike, our resident high school U.S. history teacher, tells us about somebody from U.S. history who has an interesting story. And in this episode, it talks about somebody who suffered a pretty grievous injury, but then lived for quite a while afterwards. So Mike goes into detail about the injury and some of the after effects. So if you are squeamish, we'll see you in a couple weeks. But just wanted to put this out there before you get into the episode. So with that, I thought this was a really neat episode, and hopefully you will too. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 150 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin. That is Mike. Fia is caught up in finals week, so she will not be joining us today. So it is just the bros, just the dudes hanging out today.
Have you ever thought about, is 150 too much?
I mean,
have we done too many episodes of this podcast?
I mean, especially back in the day when we were every week. That definitely added to the number.
Right. We were doing twice as many, as it turns out, back then.
Yep, that's math. But yeah, it sure is a lot.
The wire that I use for the microphone to record this, I just noticed, is starting to fray and come undone like an iPhone charger. That's
sure.
It's coming. So at some point that's just gonna go, and maybe we end the podcast there. Maybe once my microphone just stops working, there's no goodbye episode, there's no nothing, just we're done.
We'll see about that. I feel like I can throw you $10 to get a new headphone set.
If you're throwing me $10, I'm not going to finish that sentence. All right, do we have housekeeping?
Yeah, we sure do. So do not forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. To give us feedback on the show and suggest any future topics that you'd like to hear on the show. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, make sure to fill out the guest form down in the show notes. All of that will be down there, links to various social medias and things. Next episode, 151, which I'm now realizing I should turn into some kind of Pokemon thing. Because 151 is a very Pokemon number, but
all right.
I'm sure I'll find ways to work it in. Instead, we're talking about pigs.
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 What about pigs?
All about them. Their evolution. What exactly is a pig? How is it different than a peccary? That's a word you've probably never heard before. It's a group of animals that are a whole lot like pigs, but are not pigs.
We're talking about grilling temperature?
We could.
All right.
Sure thing. I will
add
that to the notes.
In your old man smoker era yet? Very smoked meats? I feel like that's something you'll get into at some point.
Oh, I'm positive that I will. Right now, we are still in the phase of making sure our house is livable.
Okay.
So focusing on stuff like that. We actually have a plumber coming. Well, I guess at the time you're listening to this, listeners, yesterday. But tomorrow, when we're actually recording. And
how big was the dump you took?
No, it's mostly that. So when we first bought the house, or even when we came for the open house, we wanted a house with a good basement, not
right.
Immaculate, but at the very least, not dirt floors,
right,
in the basement. That's all. That's really all I wanted. And so we got that. And so when I went to look at it during the open house, it's an open ceiling basement, so you can see all the wiring and the plumbing, which is nice. Because it means if you need to change stuff, it makes it a lot easier. And I noticed all of these shut-off valves in all the lines of the plumbing. And I was like, great, if I ever need to do any work on it, that'll make it really easy. Because I can just turn it off in a handful of places, and it makes it so you don't have to drain all the water out of all the pipes in your house. Great.
Sure.
I was very excited for that. Come to find out, once we're actually now in the house, only 2 of them work. The rest just don't. Including one of the ones that does not work is the main shutoff. So if you ever need to do any work in the house, or if there's a leak, I have no way of stopping that. So it's a pretty important thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we also have a couple.
Yeah, that's going to be an issue for you.
Yeah. So we also have a couple just like slow drips. That I was like, well, if we're paying somebody to come do the main, we might as well have him do the rest. He's already here. So, setting us back a cool $650.
It's all right. You had $650 burning a hole in your pocket.
No.
Plus the extra $10 for my new microphone.
You're right, $660.
There it is.
Anyway, that's the cost of doing business for a podcast here, folks.
But the podcast itself is free, and we carry on today.
It sure is. I don't have much because my job this week is to not do work.
Yeah.
Unlike Mike, so because Fia is not here, we do not have a Seagrass Corner this week, so we're just going to head straight into the main topic of our episode. Mike Takes the Wheel, Volume 15. What are we talking about today, Mike? And more importantly, when did you decide that's what we were talking about today?
I think it was like 6:15. We recorded at 8 o'clock, so this was early for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, for context listeners, that, getting close to 2 hours is like the absolute maximum that I would even guess for when you started.
I mean, there was that one time we talked about someone that had not died until the day before we talked about them.
Yes, that's true.
Like, we're really, pushing it into the studio to finish writing the song here. I am reasonably certain, I'm not totally sure, but I'm 80% sure that you know who this is.
Okay.
And so we're going to play the fun game of the listeners
Sure.
already know who this is because it's in the
title.
episode title. But I'm going to go ahead and describe this person. And once you know this guy's name, just go ahead and interrupt me and say it.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure that you're going to get this once we get to the critical part of the story. And
Sure.
there is like a very critical part of the story here that we'll get to pretty shortly. So the gentleman that we're going to be talking about today, he was born in New Hampshire in 1823. Ish. The exact date is uncertain. It's given as July 9th, 1823.
Okay.
And we don't know a whole hell of a lot about his upbringing. It says here on his Wikipedia page, this is the primary source I'm going to be kind of going
Sure.
off of, is the Wikipedia page. I do watch a couple of fun YouTube videos to help reinforce a couple of things for me.
Okay.
But that's the main thing we're working with here is Wikipedia. And that it is, for the record, one of the very well-sourced and just easy-to-read Wikipedia articles that I've ever had the chance to read. It's one of those things where it wasn't difficult at all. It was almost like a book reading.
That's always nice.
Yeah. So, again, we don't know a whole hell of a lot about him.
What was the year again?
1823.
1823. Okay.
Born in 1823. And so the doctor who's going to play a rather large role in the story, but a doctor knew him before our particular event here, and said he was a perfectly healthy, strong, active young man, 25 years of age. He was 5'6", about 150 pounds. An iron frame, an iron will, a muscular system that was unusually well developed. And he was reasonably well handsome, as well too, by most accounts. And by most accounts, he was just kind of like a nice, affable, young man. He winds up getting a job, in explosives, particularly with tamping, like blowing holes in mountains. And he first, it says here, may have first started working with explosives on farms, or nearby mines. Like, we're not, again, entirely sure.
Okay.
And then in July 1848, he was employed on the construction of the Hudson River Railroad near Cortlandt Town, New York.
Hey, that's where I went to college.
Not the same Cortlandt Town. It's spelled a little different. Cortlandt, located in Westchester County.
Oh, bummer.
Which just, like...
Yeah,
why?
Well, it's weird, because there's Cortland, the city of Cortland.
Right.
And then there's also, like, a Cortlandville that is, like, 2 steps away. So I was like, maybe there was something there, but okay.
Yeah, regardless if it was near where we grew up or where you currently live, dear listener. He was by September of that year, so he starts in July. In September of that year, he was a blasting foreman, pardon me, on construction projects. Again, you're blasting holes in mountains, so that way,
right.
You can build roads and trains and stuff, through that. And in September 1848 is when our actual event takes place here. And so the way that most of this works is, or the way it's supposed to work is that you drill a hole into the mountain.
Yep.
You put some gunpowder in there. You put some sand in there.
Yep.
And then just like a dude takes a rod and, tamps it down.
Yeah.
And really pushes it down in there. And then you're able to, blow it up, makes a big hole. You do that a couple of times and you're able to get through the mountain.
Yeah. Which,
that is.
It's interesting. Yeah. I like that we're getting a little geology on a Mike Takes the Wheel.
Just like only a little bit here. There are more disciplines that we're going to get into later on.
Okay.
That are a bit more afield from this podcast, but just a little bit here. And so what had happened was, or at least what our best guess as what had happened was, is our protagonist of the story here probably forgot to put the sand in the hole.
Oh no.
Oh no, indeed.
That seems like a very bad mistake.
This seems like an incredibly big mistake. And so there's gunpowder in the hole.
Mm-hmm.
He takes his rod and he starts tamping it down into the hole. And something distracted him. It may have been like the men working behind him. Is what the Wikipedia article said. Some other places gave some different ideas.
Okay.
Not particularly relevant here. But he's tamping at this point just straight gunpowder.
Right.
Which you can imagine being a rather large problem. So as he's tamping it down in there, it ignites. And the iron rod that he's using to tamp it in gets shot through basically the underside of his cheek, up through his brain and out through his skull.
Yeah, because also listeners, this isn't like when they do this isn't like a small amount of gunpowder. This isn't
right.
like a shotgun shell's worth of gunpowder. No, this is like I'm trying to think.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's like basically a whole stick of dynamite at least.
Right, enough to where, the tamping rod, which was 1.25 inches around and 3 foot 7 inches long, weighing 13.25 pounds.
Yeah, just a solid iron rod like that. Yeah,
just a solid iron rod. Explodes, goes through this guy's face and skull, essentially, and it landed about 80 feet away, smeared with blood and brain. And at this point, Gavin, I do have to ask, do you know who we're talking about?
I have no idea. Maybe I'm too hung up on the New Hampshire, because I know a negative number of famous New Hampshireites.
I wouldn't call this person a famous New Hampshireite, just like in the sense of he could have been born anywhere.
Okay.
But so generally speaking, like when an iron rod goes through your brain, like that's the end of our story here.
Yeah.
That is not the end of our story here for a man, and I will give you his name, because if you don't know it at this point, you probably won't wind up getting it. But it's a guy named Phineas Gage. That name doesn't ring a bell at all for you?
It's like, I'm sure I've heard it before, but I don't know from where.
So Phineas Gage has become a famous American story, and famous story in a number of different fields. So after rod goes through, again, his face and head,
mm-hmm.
he had some convulsions in his arms and legs, and as best as I can tell, it's not specifically said here, but I imagine was knocked out.
Yeah, oh god.
However, within a few minutes, he was speaking, walking with very little assistance, and he was sitting upright in a cart for the 3/4 mile ride back to his house. About 30 minutes after the accident, a doctor showed up at his house and found him just sitting in a chair. Pardon me, it was at a hotel, not a house. Found him just sitting in a chair and was greeted by him like, "Hey, how's it going?" And I'll quote from the doctor here. When I drove up, he said, "Doctor, here's business enough for you. When I first noticed the wound upon his head, before I aligned for my carriage, the pulsations of the brain were very distinct. The top of the head appeared somewhat like an inverted tunnel, as if some wedge-shaped body had passed from upward below." Yeah, that would be the rod.
Yep.
I probably should have got this before, but if you're squeamish, dear listener, you can skip this one.
Yeah, no, I'll put a thing beforehand in the edit.
Yeah, no, probably a good idea. Mr. Gage, during the time I was examining this wound, was relating the manner in which he was injured to the bystanders. I did not believe Gage's statement at the time, but thought he was deceived. Mr. Gage persisted in saying that a bar went through his head. Basically, the doctor's like, I don't believe the story that you're telling me right here. Mr. Gage got up and vomited. The effort of vomiting pressed out about half a teacup full of brain through the exit hole at the top of the skull, which fell upon the floor. Yeah. And at that point, like, I imagine the doctor was like, yeah, okay. I guess that's what happened. It was, the doctor describes it as something like military surgery. Like, you don't see these kinds of injuries in regular civilian life. As you can imagine, even in the 1800s, like, seeing somebody that was both alive and had an injury like this, again, rod through the skull and face, and there's brain coming out, like, even in the 1800s, you tended not to see this kind of injury.
Because you said this was 1848?
1848, I believe. Yes,
okay.
1848.
Yeah, so it's not even like big industrial factories were like commonplace at this point. Like, they were around, but they, industrial accidents were not a widespread thing that they would come to be in, like, up until like the 1920s. When you think of like the Union stuff in the 20s with like all the industrial accidents that caused a lot of people to strike,
and even a little bit earlier into into like the 1870s and 80s when you get the Gilded Age, but like again, regardless, this is pre-Civil War. We are hand tamping in gunpowder and stuff, clearly. However, the when the doctor from before he knew him, I was able to show up around 6 p.m.
Okay.
He says that Phineas Gage recognized him right away. That it was he seemed to be perfectly conscious, but was exhausted from the hemorrhage.
I bet.
Again, all of this seems like very big understatements at this point. He said in the quote here, his person and the bed in which he was laid was literally one of gore and blood. Gage was swallowing a lot of blood. It was he was throwing it up every 15 to 20 minutes. And again, like, all of this kind of tracks with somebody that like is dead, but his body just hasn't found out yet.
Right.
Like, like, we can all imagine or have heard of injuries where the person technically was not dead immediately, but there is no surviving something like this. And yet our story is not close to done in this case. And so when this story gets told in a lot of textbooks, particularly a lot of like psychology textbooks, they wind up kind of glossing over what happened immediately after. It was the injury happened, he was sitting upright and mostly fine, and he was treated, and they start talking about what happens much, much later. But I will again, partly because I find the Wikipedia article itself kind of so captivating. I'm going to go through just a little bit of like what took place over the next couple of days and weeks. So again, we're starting in September of 1828. So what happened is his doctor here, with the first doctor's assistants, they both wind up shaving the scalp region around the tamping iron's exit, remove some coagulated blood, some bone fragments, and quote here, an ounce or more of protruding brain. And again, 1880s medical I can only imagine how they were going about this, what the medical training was, if it was like, it is flooring to me. That even if he was sitting upright, that one of them didn't just accidentally kill him by removing the wrong piece of brain.
Right. And
And
also
yet,
just like an ounce is like it sounds small. That's not in a small part of brain to just
yep, right,
fall out.
y- exactly. After probing for foreign bodies and replacing 2 large detached pieces of bone, Harlow closed the wound with adhesive straps, leaving it partially open for drainage. The entrance wound in the cheek was bandaged only loosely for the same reason. A wet compress was applied, then a nightcap, then further bandaging to secure these dressings. Harlow also dressed Gage's hands and forearms, which, along with his face, had been deeply burned, in order that Gage's head be kept elevated. And then later that evening, again, his doctor said his mind was clear. He's got constant agitation of the legs, being either retracted and then extended, and says he doesn't really care to see his friends because he'll be back at work in just a few days.
My God.
And again, this is a lot of times where the story winds up ending is like, yeah, he was back at work in a couple of days. Not quite.
Okay.
It took him. It was a really uneven kind of recovery based on
I
what
bet.
we have here. Where what like he seemed to be like, all things considered, kind of fine the day of. So he was able to recognize his mother and uncle on the morning after the incident. On the second day, he lost control of his mind. He became delirious. By the fourth day, he was rational again. He knew his friends. Then after a week's improvement, he was entertaining some people for the first time. And that was the first time that his doctor was like, maybe he's going to be okay. Like, maybe this isn't just a dead cat, but like maybe he'll be okay.
Huh.
And then 12 days after the accident, he was semi-comatose. He wouldn't speak unless he was spoken to. When he did speak, he was kind of like one syllable.
Sure.
He was his left eye, which if you look up a lot of photos of him, you will see his left eyelid droop down. His left eye actually remained, and he had vision coming out of it, at least partial vision, for the first week or two.
Okay.
Eventually, his left eyelid just kind of drooped down, and he no longer had vision in his left eye, but it is still there.
Okay.
At this time, there is a fungus that is in the area where the tamping rod went through. Wounded brain all coming out of the top of the head. By the 14th day, exhalations from the mouth and head are horribly fetid, comatose, but will answer in monosyllables if aroused. Will not take nourishment unless strongly suggested. This is what's being described as someone that's about to die.
You said this was 12 days now?
This is 12. We're at the 14th day at this point.
Okay.
One of his friends that showed up there just basically told the doctor, like, dude, stop feeding him, stop, like,
yeah,
let him go. At this point, Dr. Harlow refused. He cut off the fungi that were sprouting from the top of the brain, and filled the opening with a silver nitrate.
Okay.
With a scalpel, he opened up like the top of the nose, and immediately there was 8 ounces of discharge of ill-conditioned pus and blood.
Okay.
That came out at this point. And some other people have written, very few doctors in 1848 would have had the experience with cerebral abscess, which Harlow left, and probably saved Gage's life. And again, yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
On the 24th day, Gage was able to get up. He took a step off his chair. 1 month after that, he was walking up and down stairs about the house. And while the doctor was, gone for a week, he was up about in the street every day except for Sunday, with a desire to return to his family in New Hampshire. He really, like, his friends were like, "Are you sure?" And he's like, "Yeah." He went, without an overcoat and thin boots. With apparently, got wet feet and a chill. He soon got a fever, but by mid-November, he was feeling better in every respect and walking about the house.
Huh.
At this point. By November 25th, we're talking about 2.5 months later. At this point, Gage was strong enough to return to his parents' home in New Hampshire. He was notably feeble, thin, a little childish. By December, he was writing out, improving both mentally and physically. And by the following February, he was able to do a little work around the house. feeding some of the horses and cattle.
And so by this point, it's like 6 months after. Yeah?
At this point, it's like 3 months after, so it's about December at this point.
Okay, I heard you say February, so.
Oh goodness, yeah, no, you're right. So by February, so 5-6 months, is where he's able to do some work around the house.
Okay.
By the following August, so we're at almost a year. His mom was telling other physicians that like he seems a little off. His memory's not quite what it was. But like if you didn't know him, you probably wouldn't notice. If you didn't know him, ignoring the fact that his eyelid droops down,
that's wild.
It is, it's absolutely nuts.
Yeah.
Again, you can read about some of the specific injuries here on the Wikipedia article. And where the story gets interesting for a lot of people is at this point stories kind of diverge like wildly differently.
I'm sure.
As to what happened to him and his attitude and personality after that. In different textbooks, part of what some of the Wikipedia article covers here and some of the videos I watched were just how like wildly off base and without sourcing a whole lot of textbooks are. Gage has become like a staple of both psychology and neurology. In part because this is I believe it was the left temporal lobe is what got affected. By him. And for at least the first little while, you had some people around him that were saying that he was not quite Gage. Like, the man was in front of me, but it was something different about him. He just wasn't the same person. He was not able to keep his job at that point as a tamper. It's a little bit unclear exactly why, but as best as I can tell, as best as I've been able to figure out here, it was more because he was just kind of irritable, getting in fights.
Sure.
Right. Not necessarily that he couldn't physically do the job. He winds up showing up at Harvard Medical School, not to take classes or anything, but like as a, hey, come look, guys.
Yeah.
He shows up at the Barnum American Museum in New York City. This is not Barnum Circus, the P.T. Barnum thing.
Right.
It seems like he was kind of promoting himself as like hey, come see the man who lived with a rod through his head. Like, it's, I don't want to quite say circus or freak show, but something kind of resembling
similar vibes.
Absolutely similar vibes. Eventually in August 1852, he was invited to Chile to work as a stagecoach driver.
What?
Phineas was
the country?
Yeah. Phineas wasn't accustomed to entertain little nephews and nieces with the most fabulous recitals of wonderful feats and hairbreadth escapes without any foundation except in his fancy. He conceived a great fondness for pets and souvenirs, especially for children and dogs, only exceeded by his attachment to his tamping iron, which remained his constant companion for the rest of his life.
Whoa. Okay. So, we're give or take 1850 by this point.
Yeah.
1852. Okay. How did he get there? Number one. Like, my American history is okay, but not terrific. Panama Canal didn't exist by that point.
Not even a little bit.
So, like, he had to sail all the way around the south of South America up around to Chile.
I believe, let me double check this. I think he was living in California at that point.
Okay, that at least makes the trip faster.
I could be wrong. I don't. I mean, I don't know. I can't find it here exactly where it was. And how there is no mention of how he got to Chile. Just that he was invited to Chile, to work there. And by all accounts, when he got there, he did great.
Did he speak Spanish?
It does not say here. It doesn't. It does. I don't know exactly. Again, there's not a whole lot of details about.
Right.
There's not a whole lot of details about quite a lot of this man's life. Actually, a lot of this has been pieced together. in different ways. We know he went to Chile. We know he seemed to do reasonably well as a stagecoach driver from about 1852. He left Chile for San Francisco by 1859 in pretty failing health at this point. It seems like he had late onset epilepsy, which is rather common in these kinds of injuries.
Yeah.
Also,
I totally let the fact that he just kept the iron by him this whole time.
Yeah. He donated it at one point and then got it back like a year later and just kept it with him.
I mean, I'm sure it was part of his like shtick.
Sure. Absolutely. To have that thing with it. Right. And again, you can still look up, there's I believe 2 surviving pictures of him. Like even still with a catastrophic injury, like a pretty good looking man, all things considered. Again, particularly for the 1800 standards, where I assume he's bathing like once a week. If that.
Yeah.
Apparently he had by 1860, in May 1860, he had a pretty severe convulsion. The family physician was called in and bled him, bloodletting.
Yeah.
The convulsions were repeated frequently for the next day and night, and then he died in what's referred to as in or near San Francisco.
Okay.
May 21st, 1860. But that is 12 years post-accident where he was able to, again, at the beginning, there was a lot of, he's here, but he's not really here. There's something off. For quite a lot of that time, at the very least, he was able to hold down a stable job. There's not a whole lot of perfect documentation on how he was or his behavior while he was there running the stagecoach, but he was able to do the job for about 7 years. In 1866, the doctor who had lost all trace of Phineas Gage and just kind of assumed he was never going to hear from him again, learned that he had died in California and made contact with his family. At that point, they had his skull exhumed, and were able to do a number of studies of it in Massachusetts. The tamping iron bears the following inscription, which has a couple of mistakes on it. This is the bar that shot through the head of Mr. Phineas P. Gage. Phineas is spelled wrong. In Cambridge, Vermont, September 14th, which is, I believe, a day later than it actually happened, 1848. He fully recovered from the injury and deposited this bar in the Museum of the Medical College of Harvard University. Gage's headless remains were moved to Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in California. And his skull is, I believe, still either on display or at least possessed by, I can look this up in just a second, in Boston, in the Warren Anatomical Museum in Boston. And, like, where he's become, kind of famous, as a famous American story, is mostly in psychology.
Yeah.
About how, like, because at this time it wasn't clear what different parts of the brain did. Did all parts of the brain deal with all parts of being a human? Like, how much brain could you lose and still find? Like, nobody quite knew. And this was, this was kind of confirmation that there was different parts of the brain were responsible for different things. And you could lose part of the brain and still live and be affected in different ways. This winds up taking up the field of phrenology for a little while. If you don't know what that is, it's like feeling the bumps on people's brains. It's a rather racist pseudoscience.
Yeah, it was used a lot to justify white people being like inherently smarter than basically anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was, phrenologists at the time, said that different parts of the brain were responsible for different things, and they were, they did the wrong work but got the right result, at least in that particular case, about how different parts of the brain are responsible for different things. Now, phrenology as a whole has been discredited as a pseudoscience, but it helps advance that idea. I won't go through everything here because I would just be reading other people's work, and I again encourage people to go check out Phineas Gage. But the idea of being able to lose part of your brain and still be able to function mostly normally having some amount of mood changes or personality changes, like became huge. It was part of what got talked about when lobotomies became part of a thing, where the frontal lobes just kind of become fried. I believe we did an episode on the Kennedys, like the lesser known Kennedys.
Yep.
At one point, I almost picked one of those today, and then I remembered we already did that as an episode. But like it is the tales of Phineas Gage sort of outgrew the man, but even just grounded in what we do know, it is like a rather remarkable story that really is one of those cases that really wind up helping advance the cause of psychology, for a lot of people. One final story I'll recount.
Okay.
Is that there was no pictures of him for the longest time. Like it was one of those things where stories had been told.
Sure.
And it's one of those things you just kind of had to believe, because it was 1848 when he had his injury, and there's not a whole lot of pictures from people that died in 1860. And then there was this family that was going through their attic. They were they like to collect a whole bunch of photos of old people, and they were uploading them to Flickr, one of the older internet file sharing sites, and I believe they called it the Whaler. And they described the first portrait shows a disfigured yet still handsome Gage with left eye closed and scars clearly visible, well dressed and confident, even proud. And they called it the Whaler because they thought that this was like a whaling accident with a harpoon. And the people online were like, okay, that's not a whaling accident. That's not a harpoon. Like,
yeah,
you have misidentified what this is.
Because presumably he had the rod with him as well.
He has the rod with him in the portrait here. And eventually somebody online was like, that might be a picture of Phineas Gage. And if that's what it is, it's the only surviving portrait of Phineas Gage. They go through the proper channels, they get it figured out, and it turns out to indeed be, at that time, the only surviving portrait of Phineas Gage. And the next year, there was another portrait identified in 2010.
That's cool.
And yeah, like it's a very cool addendum to the story about how there was because of the internet, we were able to find photographs, daguerreotypes of this guy that became a really interesting and famous American story, and worldwide for that matter. And yet, like, you sort of had to believe it, and I'm sure there was quite a lot of people that just didn't believe the story until they saw some pictures. His skull is, I believe, still on display. There's a number of 3D models that you can look at that are on his Wikipedia page, about just like where the tamping rod went through and the kind of damage and blunt force trauma that was suffered by him. But that is the story of Phineas Gage. If you look him up online, there's a whole lot of really excellent videos. Again, I've talked about the Wikipedia article, and I believe in quite a lot of intro to psychology classes he winds up getting mentioned.
Okay.
I
took intro to psychology when I was a senior in high school. So like I do not remember whether we talked about him or not.
Yeah, I certainly not every class by any means, but I remember I think a science teacher at one point talked about him when I was in middle school, I want to say. I remember my 7th grade science teacher, Mr. Mancabelli, mentioning him. And Hank Green in a couple early Vlogbrothers videos. Made some videos about him. If you don't know Hank Green,
love Hank.
I'm frankly surprised you are listening to this particular podcast if you don't know Hank Green. But that is the story of Phineas P. Gage. It doesn't say here what the P stands for, but Phineas P. Gage.
Yeah, it's just really interesting because you hear how like amazing and complex the brain is, that it's like that it all works together so seamlessly. So I remember like the first time I learned, like when I was much younger, about like what a lobotomy is. And I'm like, what do you mean you can just like
wait, isn't that murder? Like,
right, I was like, what do you mean you can just disconnect like somewhere between a quarter and a third of the brain, and like the person just kind of acts like they don't have a personality? That's all that happens. Simplifying, but I was like, what do you mean that can happen and the person is like alive and can walk and talk and do stuff fine? Like, how is that possible?
And like,
let alone
right.
something like this.
Right, and that's, with science and scalpels and being very careful, not just, a tamping accident. Again, if you get a chance, go look up some pictures, or some like the 3D modeling that's been done where you can see like it, this was not a small thing that happened. It really, up under his cheek through the top of his head. It's wild. It is wild to think about, and it's wild to think about the human brain. And I don't know if you know this, Kevin. I've been thinking a lot about the human brain over the last couple of months. And I don't have much else to say or a great way to end the episode other than to say that it is a wild story. It's wild. That's the kind of thing that is possible in humans, particularly again with the medical technology of the 1840s,
right?
Guiding us here.
Yeah, it's like the fact that he didn't just get like tetanus instantly,
right?
And died from tetanus is insane. That he had fungus growing direct in his brain. That's the plot of The Last of Us.
Somebody that should have died much earlier than he did. And Phineas Gage, I salute you. For those of you that want to know, he died at age 36.
Okay.
Which again, earlier than he would have lived in all likelihood otherwise. But 12 years, he lived literally a third of his life, with this particular accident. So and that is all I have.
I did look up a little bit because I'm not super familiar with what the different parts of the brain do.
Yeah.
And so I did look it up. And the temporal lobe is pretty much just like sensory and language stuff. So that makes sense that you could walk and kind of do stuff more or less fine. But when he was, having a spell, then he would only answer in monosyllables or, stuff like that. But yeah, that's just insane that this was even possible. And it's like this, it also makes you wonder how many more times things like this happened in places that we just never heard about. Because it's like, if something like this happened in I don't know, to a migrant worker who was building the Transcontinental Railroad or something, we'd never hear about it.
No problem. They were probably buried right underneath where the railroad went, without any kind of proper medical attention. Giving Phineas Gage his due, absolutely seems appropriate here on episode 150 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That was Gavin. Hopefully we'll have Fia next week to talk about some pork. But until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Mike Bryson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.